So last class, I believe we talked about the demand, right? And the most important thing for you to remember is the difference between movement along the curve and the change or shift of the curve, right? So when the own price changes, what happens to the demand? If the price of potatoes goes up, what happens to the demand for potatoes?
Doesn't change.
Good, good. Yeah, now it works, right? Right, nothing happens, right? If the price of potato changes, demand for potatoes don't change, right? But if something other than the own price changes, like consumer taste or price of related goods, then, right, the demand curve will shift to the right or to the left, right? And that's what we mean by what we call a change in demand. Okay? So make sure you understand that difference. Okay? All right. So once you understand that about the demand, this understanding supply is very easy because it's basically the same idea. We are repeating the same ideas, right? On the other side or the opposite direction, right? So we have supply schedule and supply curve here. I have a feeling that we talked about this at the end of last class, right? So the law of supply means there's a positive relationship between the prices and the quantity supply. In other words, when the prices go up, the suppliers would increase their production and supply to the market. And what was the reason for that? What's the motivation for the suppliers to increase the output when the price rises? Profit, yes. Very good, right? Because when the price goes up, it increases the profitability for that product, right? So as the producers increase their output, they can make a lot more money, right? Yeah, okay, good. So yeah, we'll talk about that. And the same as the demand, we can talk about the shift in the supply curve, right? In other words, when the price of something goes up or down, right? What happens to the demand for that product? If the price of smartphone goes up, what's going to happen to the supply for that supply for a smartphone? Right. Supply will never change, right? When the price of something goes up, right? Supply for that product will not change. Only the quantity supplied will change, right? But if something other than the own price changes, right, then the supply can shift or change, right? And those other things are price of inputs, technological change, or prices of substitutes in production, right? Or number of firms in the market, like number of producers in the market, right? And the expected future price, right? So let's talk about these things today, right? So first of all, input prices. Okay? Input price is a very important determinant of the supply. Okay? In what's the most important input in any production?
Labor.
Labor. Very good, right? Without labor, you can't produce anything, right? So smartphone, for example, we can think of these possible input like processor chip, touch screen, plastic housing, labor, or some other thing. I'm sure there are many other things that required to produce smartphones, like utility or whatever, right? All right. So let's say price of labor goes up. What's price of labor? Wage, right? So let's say there was a strike among the labor. Workers went on strike demanding higher wages, right? And let's say they were successful, right? So they successfully negotiated higher wage. Yeah? Then what's going to happen to the supply for smartphone?
Decrease.
Why?
Because it costs more.
Okay, it costs more, right? Okay, good, good. Why not the quantity supplied? You're saying the supply itself will decrease, right? Okay? So we have price, quantity. Let's say this is initial supply curve for the smartphone, right? And the story is, okay, wages went up. What's going to happen to this supply? You're saying supply goes down, or supply curve will shift to the right. I mean to the left, right? How do you know?
Because at the same price.
At the same, price of the output, right? Yeah. So what we're talking is we are assuming the price of the smartphone did not change; it stayed the same, right? Only the wages went up, right? So as I said last class, the profit is the difference between the total revenue and total cost, right? And total revenue was P times Q. Total cost was P AC or ATC times Q, average total cost, right? Or per unit cost times Q, right? So the profit is P minus ATC times Q, right? And this is what? That's per unit price minus per unit production cost, right? So this difference is what?
Net profit.
Huh?
Net profit.
Net profit? Net profit? You can say it's a per unit profit. Profit per unit or marginal profit, right? Okay, so this is the profit per unit. Every unit you produce, right? You make that much money, right? Well, when the wage increases, average total cost will increase, right? Which means your profit margin will be reduced, right? Per unit profit goes down, right? So this product becomes less profitable to the producer, right? The smartphone now becomes less profitable, right? That's why they're going to reduce the unit of output, right? How many units they produce, right? But it's not the movement along the curve. We're not moving from this point to this point, right? Because we are assuming the smartphone price is still the same, right? So we are moving from one point to this point, from A to B, right? So that's off the chart, off the curve, right? This initial demand curve, but now we end up at other than the initial demand curve, right? I'm sorry, supply curve. Okay, so we have a completely new price-supply relationship, price-supply, quantity-supply relationship, right? So this original relationship between the prices and quantity supply does not hold anymore, right? We have a completely new relationship, right? That is a leftward shift of the supply curve. Okay? Right? That's what happens when the input price goes up. Right? What if input price goes down? If any input becomes cheaper, what's going to happen? Yeah, supply curve will shift to the right, right? Or there will be an increase in supply. Okay? Again, at the same price level, the quantity supplied will increase. Right? So that's not a movement along the curve, but it's a shift of the supply curve. Right? That's what we call an increase in supply. Okay? The technological change or technological advancement works exactly the same way as input price. Actually, in fact, that's the same idea basically, right? What do we mean by a better technology? When we say we now have a better technology, right? What do we mean by that exactly? What does the better technology achieve?
Higher efficiency.
Okay, higher efficiency. What do you mean by efficiency? What's the result of higher efficiency? Why is it good?
With same resources,
Mm-hmm.
what can produce more?
Right. While using the same amount of resources, if you have a better technology, that means we can have larger output, right? Using the same amount of resources. Because we are using the resources more efficiently, right? Or if you don't need to produce larger output, right? There's no reason to produce larger output. What? Is using better technology good? Is it useful? Why? You don't need to produce larger output. So what is the new technology or better technology for? What's the use of the better technology?
It means less
Yeah.
resources.
It means you can use less amount of resources, right? While producing the same amount of output, you can use less amount of resources. That's it, right? So that's what a better technology means. In other words, right? Basically it's the same thing as input price. Right? If you have a better technology, it becomes cheaper to produce certain output, right? To produce each unit of certain output, right? Better technology means it costs less. Just like input price went down, right? That's why I said it's basically the same thing. Having a better technology achieves the same results as cheaper input, finding a cheaper input, right? Okay, so, well, if you have a better technology, what that means is supply will shift to the right, okay? Because using the same amount of resources, you can produce larger output, right? What if you have worse technology? It's hard to imagine having a worse technology. I mean, technology usually develops and improves every year, right? But I guess the only thing we can imagine is here. Governmental restrictions on use of certain type of fertilizer might decrease the supply of wheat, right? So apparently you've been using certain type of fertilizer, right? I guess this one was developed about 10 years ago, and you've been using this fertilizer, and suddenly they found out that there is some harmful chemical in this fertilizer, right? So government prohibited using this fertilizer, right? Then your output may decrease, right? Maybe that can be an example of worse technology, right? Or in this example right here, a new, more productive variety of wheat would increase the supply of wheat, right? So I think we're talking about what, genetic engineering these days, right? In science, in biology, they do a lot of research in genetic engineering, right? And right now we are eating a lot of products which are results of genetic engineering, genetically improved species of corn, whatever, right? So you can produce a lot more corn using small amount of resources, right? If you use this genetically improved or modified corn, right? But there is always a debate about this genetic modification. Is it really good? Or many people, many scientists believe that we just don't know everything about the long-term consequence of genetically modified products, right? So some people feel really, unsafe, right, about eating genetically modified grain or pork or whatever, right? So let's say they found out, and then let's say government suddenly came up with a regulation, right, that, which prohibits the genetic engineering or using the genetically altered species, right? Then, you can say that's a, I guess, retrogress in technology, right? You are using, I guess, inferior technology, I guess. Then the supply will shift to the left or decrease. Yeah. All right. Prices of substitutes and number of firms. Okay. Well, in demand, when we were discussing demand, we've talked about the substitutes and complement relationship, right? And at that time, we used the example of what? Big Mac and Whopper as a substitute, right? So price of Big Mac goes up. What happens to the demand of Whopper? Increases, right? Right? You should be able to think about it quickly. About Coke and Pepsi, right? If price of Coke goes down, suppose Coke is having sale this week, right? Let's go to a convenience store, right? Across the street, and you found out that they are having 2-for-1 sale on Coke, right? What's going to happen to the demand for Pepsi? Shift left or decrease, right? Demand for Pepsi will decrease, right? Yeah. So that's the idea of substitutes, right? Here we're talking about substitutes in production. We're not talking, substitutes in production, right? A lot of company plants or facilities, right, production facilities, they have some flexibility. When they design these facilities, right, they intentionally make it flexible in type of production they can do in any facility. For example, about I'd say about 7 or 8 years ago, the Kia Motors built an assembly plant in Georgia, right? United States. Previously, Hyundai and Hyundai had only one assembly plant in Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, right? I'm not sure whether they have another assembly plant in California. Does anybody know? Hyundai? I thought it was Montgomery, Alabama was the only assembly plant in the United States, right? But I think about 8 years ago, they built a new plant in Georgia, right? It's a huge and very modernized facility, right? And it took, I think, about 3 to 5 years to complete this facility, right? And the facility was formerly named the Kia Assembly Plant, okay? And original intention was to produce Kia SUV like Sportage, right? So it was designed to produce the Sportage. It was their first planned production right there, right? But when the plant finally opened, the first product they produced there was Santa Fe, actually, the Hyundai SUVs rather than Kia SUV, right? Because apparently there was a huge demand, right, for Santa Fe, which was, I guess, popular, right? And the demand for sportage was not that great, right? Yeah, so something like that. So the producers have a few choices, right, or substitutes in their production, right? They can produce either A or B or C or something like that, depending on the demand, right? So if okay, let's say the price of, let's say, A, products A and B, price of A goes up, what's going to happen to the demand for B? Assuming A and B are substitutes in production, if the price of A goes up, what's going to happen to the demand for B?
Still increase.
Right? Because apparently the producers will want to produce more of A, because now the price of A is higher, which makes A more profitable, right? So the demand for, supply for B, supply for the product B will decrease. Okay? Huh? No, increase. Sorry. Just trying to find out whether you're still awake. After the lunch, it's easy to doze off, right? So yeah, so when the price of A increases, the suppliers will choose to produce more of A, which means supply for B Which one is right? Is this right or what? Give me the final answer. Apparently I can't make up my mind here. Yeah. When the price of A goes up, supply for B will decrease, right? So this is correct, right? Finally. Yeah, you should be able to just think through, right? And find the don't try to memorize this thing, like substitute and complement relationship, right? It will be very confusing, right? You should be able to think through, right? When you try to solve any problem, right? Okay, and number of firms means if there are more producers, certainly the supply will increase. Okay? When something is first introduced, like what was it? DVD, yeah, DVD player. DVD players. Yeah? I mean, there was before DVD there was a VCR. Do you guys know what VCR is? Huh? In your generation? I think that VCRs almost disappeared as soon as you guys were born. Huh? VCR is a video cassette recorder. Yeah? It's a huge tape. Right? You push in and play the movie, right? And all these, there were video stores, rental stores, right? So you could go to the rental store and rent this movie, this size tape, right? and watch the movie at home, right? And about I would say about 15 years ago from now, right? Or the VCRs were replaced by DVDs, right? Movies were now produced on DVDs, not instead of cassette tape, right? Because this is what we call analog, analog storage of the data, right? And this is digital, right? You know the difference between analog and digital, right? So analogs, first of all, the quality is not very good, and because it is recorded on a tape, right? And it's actually moving part, right? So every time you use the tape, it deteriorates, right? And depending on the temperature, whether it's a summer or winter, this plastic tape, the shrinks or becomes longer, right? Depending on the temperature, right? So after about many years of usage, right, this VCR will become unusable, right? It deteriorates, right? But DVD, it doesn't matter how many times you watch the movie, right? And how many years, as long as you don't put it under the direct sunlight, right? It's still a plastic, so it can warp or it can be damaged by heat or sunlight, right? But that's you can preserve the record or the data almost perfectly, right? Almost permanently, right? Alright, so even DVD, I don't think people are using DVD anymore. I mean, I have lots of DVD movies at home right now, right? But the DVD player's broken, right? Because it has moving part, right? Whatever has moving part like motor, it is bound to have problem, right? It wears out, right? So the perfect equipment is the one without any moving part, right? Okay, so these days, what? How do you watch movie?
Online.
Huh?
Which online?
Online, either internet download, or if you have to carry it around, maybe you can use a USB drive, right? Which does not have any moving part, right? I mean, of course, there's no moving part inside the disk, but even the player, like computer, you plug it into the computer, right? And computers these days, I think computers come out without hard disk these days, right? Is there any motor inside the computer these days? It used to have hard disk, but hard disks are now replaced by, what do you call? Yeah, solid state, the chip basically. So I don't think there is any moving part inside the computer other than fan. Yeah, the cooling fan has motor, right? But cooling fans are very cheap and it can be replaceable and it does not affect the data, right? Anyway, so technology develops so fast. When the DVD players first came around, it was very expensive. It was about $1,000 per unit, right? So actually, initially it was very expensive, right? It's like $3,000, but I remember when it was $1,000. But a few years later, it came down to like $200 per unit. So when the price came down that much, most of the households and average households in the U.S. could afford these DVD players. Right? Also, the DVD itself. I mean, probably you remember this size DVD, right? But the original DVDs were this big, right? Like old LP record size, right? And so it was double-sided. You cannot one side could not hold the entire movie. Usual movie is about 2 hours long, right? But because of the in the old days, this large disc, you have to flip once to play entire movie. So in the middle of the movie, you have an intersection, yeah, and you have to flip the side of the disc to play the entire movie. Yeah. Anyway, so how this price came down from $1,000 to $200, right? Within, say, a couple of years, right? Well, as the DVDs became very popular, right? When the older movies, when they were sold instead of VCRs, now all the movies were sold in DVD, right? There were a lot more producers, manufacturers of DVD players, right? So because of so many companies, like initially only the Sony, JVC, maybe a couple of producers came up with this DVD players, right? But soon, within a couple of years, right, there were a lot of companies, even Samsung, right, got into the production of this DVD players, right? So the supply of DVD players in the market shifted to the right, right? And as a result, price came down so much, right? It was an example of number of producers, number of firms in the market. Yeah? Finally, expected price. What your expected price is for the future, right? So, if we're talking about producers here, not the consumers, right? If the producer expects the price to increase next year, right? What's going to happen to today's supply of this product? If producers think the price will increase next year, what is it going to do to the supply today? Decrease, right? Because producers will try to hold off, right? Instead of selling the product right now, they'll try to keep it, store it, yeah? And wait until next year, right? When the price is higher, right? To make more money, right? But in order to do that, what? There has to be a condition, right? The product has to be non-perishable. If product is perishable, like milk, or most of the vegetables, like, yeah, then you cannot keep it for a long time until next year, right? So this idea applies only to non-perishable products. Yeah. Either in this course or next course, you will learn about this problem, the agricultural. Most of the countries have this problem, and the U.S. has gone through, still suffering this problem. Okay? The agriculture has a very unique problem. Okay? Unique problem is, I guess, well, I'm not going to be able to talk about it in detail. You won't be able to understand exactly, right? But just to give you a rough idea, right? The unique problem with the agriculture business or agricultural product is demand is very steep, demand curve, while the supply curve is normally slow. Okay? Why is the demand curve so steep? And first of all, what does that mean, right? Steep demand curve, right? compared to the normally sloped demand curve. Right? What that means is when the price changes, price, let's say, goes up from P0 to P1, right? If the demand curve was normally sloped, quantity demanded would change from Q0 to Q1. In other words, there will be a lot of decrease in quantity demanded, right? But for the case of agricultural product, what happens is it's not going to change that much, right? Because that's why the demand curve is so steep. Right? Why? Even when the price went up so much, right? Quantity demanded does not decrease that much. Can you imagine why? In other words, people still buy a lot of agricultural product. They have to. Why? Because agricultural products are mostly food, right? Even when it is very expensive, you still have to eat, right? If it's like a DVD player, right? If it's so expensive, most of the household can say, okay, forget about it, right? We don't need to watch movie at home, right? It's not really necessary, right? But for food, you can't do that, right? You still have to eat almost as much as before, right? Maybe you can reduce the quantity a little bit. Well, we might as well get on to diet and try to reduce the maybe dinner instead of. Alright, I'm not going to get into that, right? All right. What about the other side? Suppose price came down significantly, right? With the normally sloped demand curve, the quantity demanded would increase, right? Significantly. But with the agricultural demand, because demand curve is so steep, what that means is quantity demanded does not increase that much. In other words, just because food is cheaper, you can't eat too much, right? So there's only a certain amount of food people can eat, and they have to eat, right? Usually the same amount, right? That's the situation with the agricultural product, right? Well, another consequence of this is when the supply curve shifts. Let's say this year is a bumper crop year. 풍년. So supply increased. Yeah, they produced so much wheat this year because weather was perfect, right? And there was no plant disease, no drought, no flood, right? It was a perfect year, right? So the wheat production or corn production, whatever, right, increased, right? With the normally sloped demand curve, right? What's going to happen is, think about the revenue of farmers' income, right? Farmers' income is P times Q, right? Price times how many units they sell, right? So farmers' income originally would be this much, right? P0 times Q0, right? And if the demand curve was normally sloped, right? When the supply increased, right? The farmer's income would be maintained. In other words, price goes down to this level, so they would lose this much from their income, but instead the quantity would increase, so they would gain this much as a result of, increase in sales, right? So farmers' income will be pretty much constant if the demand curve was normally sloped, right? But because demand curve is very steep, right? Look what happened to farmers' income, right? If the first year original farmers' revenue was this much, right? When the supply curve shifts because of the bumper crop year, right? Price would drop very significantly, and the new farmer's income is only this much. They lose huge amount of income, and they're not going to gain any, almost none, right? So, in other words, the farmer's income, as a result of this very steep demand curve, right, it'll fluctuate significantly depending on weather or other conditions, right? So depending on whether it was a good year or bad year in the production, right, the farmer's income fluctuates significantly, right? So what does the government do? What can government do to, first of all, help farmers' income, right, to stabilize farmers' income, right? And another problem there is if the price, agricultural product price fluctuates so much, right? That means for most of the people, even non-farmers, right, the food price goes up and down significantly, right? Which is not good, right? The people like the food price to be very stable, right? And a lot of increase, especially in the food price, will create big problem for average households, right? So one of the functions of the government is to stabilize the food price, right? One of the major policies is. So what does the government have to do? Well, when the supply increases this much, government will try to purchase some of the agricultural product, right? And so that the price is not going to drop this much. In other words, they will, whatever the surplus they have, they're going to purchase, right? And store it, right? And in the next year or a couple of years later, if something happens, like drought happens, flood happens, right? So supply shifts to the left, right? And then without any intervention, the market price will increase that much, right? Which is not good. So at that time, the government will release their stored grains or cheese or whatever, right? To stabilize the food price, right? So that's what the government does, right? And in order to do that, got a big problem with this idea, right? Because a lot of agricultural products are perishable. You can't keep them for a long time, right? So usually they convert milk into powder milk, right? So that they can keep it a little longer. Even after converting into powder, you cannot keep it too long, right? Maybe a couple of years, or maybe 3 years max, right? Cheese, you have to keep it cool, right? And so keeping it refrigerated is very, very expensive, right? So when I was a full-time professor, a full-time instructor at Bowling Green State, Ohio, right? When the government truck came to the campus, right? And distributed free cheese to students, right? That was a free cheese day, right? And why would the government do that? Because they don't have any more space to store, right? And so in order to keep the new bring the new cheese in, they have to get rid of the old cheese, right? And many years ago, actually, U.S. government, they've been doing this government storage thing since 1940s, right? And around sometime in 1970s, right, they ran out of space. There's no more space to store this agricultural product, right? So what they did was they dumped huge amount of food into the ocean, right? The grain, cheese, whatever, right? And when the world found out about this, United States was severely criticized by entire world, right? Think about it. Even today, there are lots of people who are starving, dying out of starvation every day, right? In many parts of the world, right? And the dumping huge amount of food into the ocean was just unacceptable, right? So the code name for that operation was PL 480. Right? I remember this, hearing about this even as a child in Korea, right? It was a huge, issue at that time, right? So after that, the U.S. government doesn't do that. I mean, they cannot dump the food into the ocean, right? So they try everything, they distribute food to the poor college students, or try to give free food to low-income people, right? Another thing they do is in Korea these days you hear on the TV, you see this TV commercial. Usually An Sung-gi does the narration. His voice is so nice, right? And he says, "Oh, this poor child is starving, dying today, whatever, right? So many children are dying every day, right? And if you send maybe $20 per month, right, to this organization, right, we can help thousands of children to save life," something like that, right? Well, there are lots of those charity organizations, right? And people send a lot of money to this organization, right? So in the United States, they actually do this study, right? And people want to know, out of so many charity organizations, which one is the best? I mean, where should I send my money, right? So people want to know, if I send, say, $300 to this organization a year, right? How much of that money is actually used to actually send the food, right? Because if you actually find about it, right, the report is amazing, right? Out of all the money you send, more than half of the money you send is used for administrative purpose, right? What is administrative purpose? Salaries for the employees of this organization, right? And usually the top guy, the CEO of these organizations, they receive tens of millions of dollars every year as their salary. Did you know about it? Yeah? So how is it justified? Yeah? These charity organizations, they don't produce anything. They don't sell anything. They just receive the donation from people, right? And more than half of that donation is used to pay for their own salary, right? And especially the CEOs receive a huge amount of money, right? So, why do they do that? Is it acceptable? Is it justifiable? Huh? The answer is yes. And the reason is opportunity cost. Okay? This organization has made a choice of whatever, let's say Bob, right? Bob is the CEO of this organization, right? And he's receiving, say, $20 million a year, right, as his salary. Right? But if apparently he's doing his job, right? If this organization hadn't hired Bob, right? What could have been the alternative, right? And what could have been the result, right? Apparently, maybe if he's getting paid $20 million, maybe he's bringing in a lot more than $20 million, right, to this organization. Maybe because of his presence, right? People are donating a lot of money to this organization. Maybe he's really skillful and has a lot of experience in running this type of organization. So he's bringing in a lot larger donation and saving a lot of money in managing this charity organization and so on, right? So I guess that should be the justification for this high pay for top executives in this organization, right? Anyway, so more than half of this money is used for administrative purpose, right? And then another huge portion is used for transportation, to ship the food and medicine to Africa or whatever, the war-torn area, right? The actual amount of money they use to purchase food and medicine is really, really, really small. How? How is it possible? Because U.S. government actually gives out a lot of food and medicine for free, right? As long as these organizations pay the transportation, right? They say, okay, we're gonna pay for the transportation. We're gonna, use our ship to send this thing to the location, right? It's almost free, right? Because the U.S. government is running out of space to keep these things, right? So that's another thing, very important, interesting thing I learned, right? So maybe you should pay attention and find out about, how they are using your donation, right? And which organization does the better job, right? Using your money, right? All right, so that's something I digressed a little bit about this storage idea. But you understand, if they expect the future price to increase, then the current supply will decrease, vice versa. Okay? All right. So here's a summary. Just like we did before with the demand, right? You have to understand the difference between the movement along the curve and the shift of the curve, right? If own price changes, then supply doesn't change, but only quantity supplied will change because it's a movement along the curve, right? If something other than the own price changes, like technology, input price, whatever, number of firms, right? Then supply curve will shift, right? And that's what we call a change in supply, increase or decrease in supply. Okay? All right, so make sure you understand this clearly. Otherwise, it will be very confusing when you do the analysis, right? In the future, right? As we go on. All right, let's put them together. As I was explaining the farming problem, I realized that we didn't really talk about this interaction of supply and demand yet, right? But well, I'm sure you've done your preview, right? And you understood it already, right? All right. So when the demand and supply are put together in the market, right, the price is determined at the intersection, and we call it an equilibrium point, right? The crossing point between supply and demand, we call this in market equilibrium or equilibrium point, right? And of course, price is determined, we call that equilibrium price, and quantity is also determined, right? And that's called equilibrium quantity. Okay? Now, what do we mean by equilibrium? What's the concept of equilibrium? What do we mean by equilibrium? Any idea? Does that mean everything is perfect at that point? Does that mean demand and supply are balanced? Yeah? Yes? Okay. Yeah. So when people think about equilibrium, when we say equilibrium, the usual nuance or connotation people imagine is, it's balanced. Yeah? So everything is fine. Equilibrium. As a natural science, economics is a natural science, we use the same definition of equilibrium as they use in natural science. Social science. Economics is a social science, right? And we use the same definition as they use in natural science as physics or chemistry, or biology. Right? In physics, they use this example, right? Let's say here's a bowl, salad bowl, right? You drop a small golf ball, right? Golf ball inside the bowl, right? Then what's going to happen? Well, for a while, this ball will move around, back and forth, right? But eventually, this ball will stop at the lowest energy point, right? Okay? So when the ball stops, they call it an equilibrium, right? The system has achieved an equilibrium, right? In chemistry or biology, right? I remember it's been more than 40 years since I learned biology or chemistry, right? But I remember if you have a container here and there's a what we call permeable screen, the water can go through this screen, right? And if you have a two liquid here with different density, D1, D2, right? Then there will be the movement of what? I don't know. I think it was water. I don't remember exactly, right? And initially there will be some movement, but eventually it will stop. What? When the densities are equal? Am I remembering correctly? Right? Yeah. So anyway, so when the movement stops, right? They say this has achieved an equilibrium, right? So the key concept of equilibrium is what? Right. No further movement. No further movement. Or no further change. Right? That's the concept of equilibrium. Okay? Alright, and there is a stable equilibrium and unstable equilibrium. Right? Stable equilibrium means when the equilibrium is broken, the system restores itself back to the equilibrium. Like this one, right? If you shake this ball, right, then equilibrium will break because the golf ball will start moving again, right? But eventually it will come back to an equilibrium, right? The economic system or market system is a stable equilibrium. Okay? Well, so if market comes to this point, right? Suppose right now, okay? Well, we'll talk about it later, but you know, if we are at this point, there will be no change. In other words, the price will not change, quantity will not change, right? It will just stay there because quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, right? At $200, quantity demanded according to this demand curve is 10 million units, right? And according to the supply curve, right? If the price was $200, quantity supplied would be $10 million, right? So the quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, right? So there is no reason to change, right? But if something happens, let's say demand increases for some reason, right? Demand, maybe people have larger income, right? So demand curve shifts to the right, right? Then equilibrium will break, right? So use, okay. What? Oh, I'm going the opposite direction. Yeah. All right. So in the midterm exam and final exam, you're going to see some problems asking you to draw the graph, right? Illustrate the market, right? When you do that, make sure you label all these lines and the axes, right? Okay, just drawing the line is not enough. You have to mark correctly the supply curve, demand curve, price, quantity, right? Right? Now, so initially, let's say we were in equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity, right? But for some reason, demand increases. Then, at the original price, what happens? Are we still in equilibrium? Why not? What happens at the initial price, original price?
It has increased.
What increased?
The prices increased.
Well, eventually price will increase, but I'm asking if as soon as the demand curve shifts to the right, at the existing price, current price, what do we see?
There's more demand.
Yes, because now quantity demanded is here, right? This is the quantity demanded, right? But the quantity supplied is still here because supply curve didn't change, right? So what do we have here? The gap between quantity demanded and quantity supplied is called what? Shortage or excess demand, right? Quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, right? So, at the original price, apparently a lot more people want to buy, right? But the quantity supplied is not enough, right? So there is a shortage, right? And when there is a shortage, what's going to happen to the market? Yeah? Price will rise because the suppliers find out, well, we're out of stock. Yeah? There are lots of people who are trying to buy, but we don't have, and the stores don't have any more available, right? So perhaps we can charge a little bit higher price, and well, if the price goes up, then we can supply a little bit larger quantity, and still we can sell all these larger quantities, which means we can make more money, right? Raise the price and supply a little more, right? And of course that's good for the producers, right? So gradually market will adjust and arrive to this new equilibrium, right? So once the market arrived to this point, then once again what quantity demanded will be equal to quantity supplied and no further movement, right? Once the market comes to this point, it will stop. It will stay there, right? So it's called equilibrium, no further change, right? Okay, so that's the idea of market adjustment. Right? In the opposite case, for some reason, the price was too low. Oh, we already talked about this. This is the case of shortage, right? And this case was the surplus, right? For some reason, price was set a little bit high, right? So let's say they introduced a new smartphone model, right? And they set the price to $250, okay? And they estimated, well, at the price of $250, we can produce and supply 11 million units, right? But households found out that that price is a little too high, right? So not as many households could afford that $250 price, right? So only the 9 million units was sold in the market, right? So that means 2 million units are unsold, right? They are still remaining in at the store, right? Then the producers will have to adjust because there are many of their products being unsold, okay? So they will gradually lower the price, and that means they should reduce the quantity supplied, right? And eventually, when they come to the equilibrium, they'll have to stop. Market will stop. Okay? So, yeah, that's the adjustment. Okay, I think I'm out of time today, so we're going to finish this chapter quickly next week, and we're going to go on with the next chapter. Why don't you find out which chapter we're going to do next time, right? So why don't you go follow through the My Econ Lab process. Right? Have a good weekend.